Hello, and welcome to those of you who've just joined us. I'm Laura Stebbing, co-CEO of accelerateHER. I'm delighted to introduce this next session, which is a keynote from Shelley Stewart III of McKinsey & Co. on putting your money where your mouth is when it comes to meaningfully investing in Black and underrepresented minority businesses to drive sustainable change. Shelley is a US-based partner and leader in their global private equity and principal investing practice. Alongside his client work, he leads the firm's research on Black economic mobility. Shelley is on the board of directors of the National Black MBA Association. Shelley, over to you.
Laura, thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me. It's exciting and a privilege to have this discussion with you all. Before we get into the specifics of the state, I want to describe for this group what is at stake from getting this right. What is at stake from really empowering entrepreneurs who are not being empowered today to grow and scale businesses. So I'm going to share a bit of a US-based perspective, but this holds true across a number of different geographies. Black Americans in the US economy have long been held back by systemic equities. These things have been detailed and covered a lot as of late, and we'll talk a bit more about that. What we know from data is that it is 50% less likely that Black American children born in the top income quintile will remain there as adults compared to white children. So we're talking about significant downward mobility in the case of Black American children. One additional thing that we know is that a Black American born has about a 1 in 4 chance, if they're born in the lowest income bucket, to even make it to the middle class. And that's when compared to a 40 to 50% chance for white and Asian Americans. And so this human impact of not being able to tap into that potential is something that has real effects for our country and for different communities disproportionately. It also translates to lost economic output for the US economy, and again, similarly in other markets. We did some work to try to size what that potential could be. And we found that if we could close the wealth gap between Black and white Americans in the US over the course of 10 years, we could add 1 to 1.5 trillion of reoccurring economic output. And I want to be clear that this is not about putting an additional 1 to 1.5 trillion dollars in the pockets only of Black Americans. This is really a rising tides lifts all boats analysis, and all of us would benefit from this economic improvement, and it's an imperative today given where things are around the world. If we think about the current context, those are some of the outcomes of the longer term trends and then some of the potential economic output in the future if we could solve it. COVID and then some of the issues with respect to policing and the criminal justice system that are happening, particularly in the US right now, are exacerbating these challenges faced by Black Americans. So when we look at what the risk is, we found that 40% of revenue from Black-owned businesses was located in the 5 sectors that were most vulnerable to disruption during this pandemic. Think about hospitality and retail. That's compared to 25% of revenues of all US businesses. So again, disproportionately represented in those sectors. We also found that there's lots of job disruption, and that holds true across groups. But we found, again, for Black workers, this disproportionate relationship, where 39% of all jobs held by Black workers were vulnerable as a result of COVID-19. And it's about 7 million jobs. And then if you move to some of the interactions with the criminal justice system, we see some stark figures here. You have 2.5 times the lifetime risk if you're a Black man or boy of being killed by police compared to white men and boys. And with respect to imprisonment, you have a 2x chance as a Black woman when compared to a white woman. So again, these things taken as a whole, they really do paint the necessity around addressing the issues with respect to economics, criminal justice, and then there's certainly a health component, which we haven't discussed explicitly here, that is also being brought to life in the context of COVID. In thinking about what the opportunity is and the various impacts, we also know that it's important to get to the root cause of the barriers to building wealth if you're an African American or other communities that are marginalized. So as we worked through it, we found 4 stages. There's the community context. So this is the neighborhood and investment in infrastructure and public education that exists where folks are born and where they live and where they work. And we know that in the case of Black Americans, they tend to live in areas of more highly concentrated poverty where there's been underinvestment in various types of infrastructure, which has huge implications later on in life. Second big bucket is family wealth. Family wealth, there's a number of things that go into this. You can think about home ownership, also business ownership. And that's the real link to this discussion today. Business ownership is a tremendous unlock with respect to building wealth. And there's lots of disparity but opportunity there, which we'll talk more about. The third is family income. This is what people often think of when they think about economic advancement. These are the wages that you earn from, frankly, deploying your own human capital. And we know a number of things about being Black and earning an income. We know that the likelihood or duration of unemployment is significantly higher even when you adjust for education. We know that there is a persistent and widening income gap that can't be explained solely through explaining level of educational attainment or industry selection. And so there's huge opportunities here on this dimension as well. And then lastly, family savings. So how do we take income, translate that into savings and investment, and not only give us the opportunity to build wealth, but also help us build a reserve to protect us in volatile times like the one we're seeing right now. So back to this notion of wealth and the link to business ownership. As I mentioned earlier, Black families have about 1/10 of the median wealth when compared to white families in the US. It's about $17,000. Greater Black business ownership will unlock greater potential to close this gap. We know empirically that the median net worth for Black business owners is about 12 times higher than Black non-business owners. And so this is an imperative to help us address this broader issue that we're facing as a society. So as we dug into the research on what's happening with Black business owners, we did it in a way that was quite granular because we wanted to understand where the breakdown was. Where along this process from I have an idea to I've scaled this business and gone to an exit, or just scaled it and it's grown to be a big business that I didn't exit, where are things breaking down? And there were a couple of major findings. The first one is, which was an exciting finding, was that Black Americans are entrepreneurial. Now you can debate the root cause. Is it because there's a sentiment or feeling that you can't be successful in mainstream companies or other contexts? But regardless of the reason for it, Black Americans are entrepreneurial. And we found actually that 20% of Black Americans are starting or running new businesses. That's more than any other group. But then we also found that this transition from starting to sustaining is where there's really a breakdown. Only 4% of Black American run businesses are older than 3.5 years. And that's really where the fall off comes. And again, there's myriad reasons for that will be discussed and we need to keep discussing. But the starting point is that there's a culture of being entrepreneurial. There's a desire to start businesses. And the discussion that we should be having is how do we sustain and scale those businesses? So as I said, Black Americans demonstrate higher rates of entrepreneurial activity than other groups, 20% versus 20% versus 12% of white founders. So again, just hitting home this point that there's a desire to own and scale businesses. But we know there are many, many challenges facing these businesses, despite the fact that there's this desire. And we found that only 1% of venture-backed founders are Black. That's compared to 77% for white founders and 17, call it close to 20% for Asian founders. So again, there's this major disconnect between desire and actually receiving the funding needed to scale your business. We also know that there's also a huge opportunity specifically for Black women founders. Black women tend to be very entrepreneurial according to the data. And there are thousands of startups that come about every year, but only a small number receive sufficient funding. And only 4% were led by Black founders of these businesses that receive venture funding. And again, there's a huge disconnect here against a group that is very entrepreneurial. So as we look ahead and we think about, again, what the real opportunity is, zeroing in on this idea of women, and Black women in particular, being very entrepreneurial, you see that you've started to see a more positive trend as of late. But it still represents a very small percentage of total venture funding. And this is something we should celebrate the success, but at the same time, we need to take a step back and look at it holistically and say that's a very small portion of the funding. And then if you look at the fund managers and professionals, you see a little bit of the why on this. You see that Black and Latinx employees at all levels are underrepresented in the VC community. And so you start to unpack a little bit this disconnect. If the folks that are making the decisions, are not Black and brown folks, then at the same time, you've got this desire for capital by those groups. There's a bit of a disconnect. And so this is also part of solving the ecosystem issues. So as you look forward and you think about what can we do, we've been discussing as a group, and we'll continue to discuss along 4 dimensions. First is leadership. How do we really support and foster hiring retention of diverse fund managers across the ecosystem? How do we identify Black talent from the founders and entrepreneurial ranks and cultivate that talent? How do we identify Black female founders where we know there's this high drive for entrepreneurialism? The government has a role to play. Government is a huge allocator of capital, state and local level, and as well as the federal level. How do we ensure that some of those funds are being allocated towards these types of managers? And then there's just investing in certain communities and local ecosystems that have a lot of Black and brown folks in those communities as a way of fostering more economic development there that will feed on itself. So in summary, supporting Black investors is critical. We need more partner level investors who are Black. There's a huge gap in the amount of dollars that are being allocated. And we know that there's a lot at stake from an economic and human potential perspective from getting this right. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for that truly insightful presentation. And thank you to everyone joining us today. For those of you that are joining our private roundtable discussion, please follow your Zoom links, and we look forward to seeing you there shortly. Thank you.